All right. So I have this incredible career that takes me all over the place, different rainforests of the world, and I keep coming back to here, home, because it's so incredibly important. The forests of Oregon, our coastal forests, all the way up to Alaska, they're some of the most important forests on the planet, including the tropics and the boreal. And so I'm going to really kind of walk you through some of the numbers on this. Try not to get too down and dirty in the graphs that you see here, but it kind of backs me in terms of the science on this. So it'll set the stage for a lot of the general concepts that you'll hear about why forests are so important in climate regulation. Okay, so we're all familiar with trees like this, right? And you know, these are the old growth forests that are really important. And so those old growth trees are connected to the future of those kids that are surrounding those trees. And I look around the room now and I see a lot of old growth people in here, including myself. But there was also some young folks too. And you know, that's the connection here is through the forest, really important to protect. As we heard from Alex's remarks that the IPCC put their report out, and I was one of the technical reviewers on that report, and it's a scary scenario. And also the 10,000 or 20,000, I think it was, scientists sent out a warning to humanity, and I signed on to that. I signed on in 1993 in the first warning, and there was only a couple hundred of us, and now there's 20,000 saying, hey, humanity, wake up. This is the time for change. And the IPCC said we need historic, unprecedented change. So I'm not half full kind of guy in terms of the glass, half empty or full. But here's one graph that shows the direction that we're headed. And the thing about carbon is the more we put in the atmosphere, the warmer it gets. There's a direct relationship there. And so we're looking at what the temperatures have been doing over the past century. And based on this relationship, we could project forward in time. Look at the upper red there. That's where we're headed if we don't do something in Oregon and globally. And this is a 2015 drought map of the state of Oregon. Orange is drought, red is severe drought. The whole state in 2015 was in drought conditions, hence the incredible fire activity that we're seeing in places now. That's coupled with a warming climate as well. And here's a solution. And okay, so raise your hand if you know, if you had photosynthesis in biology 101, okay? Just about everybody had that, right? It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I won't talk to you about the Krebs cycle, don't worry. This is just photosynthesis. So in comes sunlight, carbon dioxide, water uptake, oxygen comes out the other end, and the plants are like us, they store excess carbon. You go to McDonald's, you eat too many fries, you store it as fat. Plants store the excess carbon in their bowls, in the case of trees, in their trunks. So a rainforest is a big stick of carbon, lots of sticks of carbon. Lots of needles, absorbing, soaking up all that carbon, and sequestering, pulling it out of the atmosphere. That's their climate function. They're also really good water towers. They hold on to water, and they release it slowly. So our atmosphere and our water depend on our forests. And here are the choices. If you go here, you got a climate sanctuary that is sucking up carbon dioxide, holding onto it, cleansing the air we breathe, purifying the water we drink. We're all familiar with this. That is not the direction we need to go, right? And the Paris Agreement has this nice little article in it. It says nations are to maintain and enhance their carbon sinks. You know, when I think of a sink, I think of washing my hands. It's not that kind of a sink, okay? Think of it more as a sanctuary. Carbon is a big sponge sucking out, absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. It's really a sanctuary or a reserve for carbon. And not all forests are created equal. Here's one of the publications we did a little way a little while back with some of the forest carbon people at Oregon State University. We mapped the most carbon-dense forest in the United States. Note the West Coast. Also note Alaska. And you can see carbon is concentrated, and these are mostly older forests and mostly wet forests. And so here's what the top 25 national forests in the country look like in terms of their carbon density. And a lot of these are in Oregon. The black are areas that are in protection. The gray is what's open for logging. Now I have to change this figure now because the Trump administration is opening up roadless areas on the Tongass. And you can see how important the Tongass is. All that carbon stored in Tongass rainforest. In Oregon, close to home, we did this publication, I think it was in 2014, again with Oregon State scientists. You split out Oregon, those black areas in Oregon are the carbon dense areas, and most of them are on Forest Service lands, and most of them are unprotected. So a lot of carbon out there that could be tied up public lands protection. The Northwest Forest Plan, we hear a lot about that. And I won't get into what these graphs mean in general, but in the 1980s, our forests were a negative. They were emitting more carbon than they were taking up. Northwest Forest Plan came in, and it started to shoot up in the right direction. So we went from a source of emissions to a reservoir of carbon, mostly on public lands in green, less so on private lands in red. So here's what happens to carbon. So you think of it as a big bucket, and that bucket is leaky. There are holes in that bucket, natural holes. Trees die, they emit carbon. Trees respire, they emit carbon. So it's a porous bucket. Carbon also comes out when you log the forest. The more holes you have in the bucket, the leakier that bucket is. The other thing about the bucket, and John will talk about this when he gets on, it's a much smaller bucket today than it was under historic conditions. So we've shrunk the size of the reserve by all the clear cutting that put the carbon in the atmosphere that will be with us for multi-generations. The carbon from the Industrial Revolution is still up in the atmosphere. It's got a long hang time. It's the hangover effect, right? You've got too much carbon going up into the atmosphere. You gotta plug the leaky bucket. I'm on the Oregon Global Warming Commission's task force on carbon. And what we've come up with using the latest data sets, carbon is coming into the forest, about 88 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. That's the bucket. It's going out from natural causes, and it's going out from logging, which exceeds natural causes. Still a net sink, equivalent to about half the state's annual emissions are being absorbed by those forests, but we could do a better job of increasing the size of the bucket and plugging these holes to make it more part of the solution to carbon pollution. How do you like that for a rhyme? Yes. Now you hear a lot about fire, and this is a graph, don't get too carried away with the numbers, but you know, fire goes up and down and so do emissions. This was mostly the Biscuit Fire in 2002. But you can see that most years, the carbon coming off of those forest fires is not a big deal. Most of what you see in those big plumes is water vapor and black carbon that has a short residence time. On average, about 11% of the emissions from the state of Oregon are due to forest fires, and most years it's more like 1 to 3%, which is far less than the emissions coming from logging. So just kind of keep that in mind, because all the attention is on fire right now, when the logging is still a big source of emissions. The other thing we've learned from this process is that the longer you keep forest in the forest, carbon in the forest, the more climate benefits you get. So on federal lands, the average time that carbon remains in the forest is over a century, and you'll notice in private lands, a lot of that carbon goes up. So you want to keep the carbon in the forest to get the climate benefit. Okay, so I'm wrapping up on these last two slides. So glass is half full, but it's getting pretty scary, you guys. Fire in our region is the face of climate change. It's the tip of the iceberg, the melting iceberg in this situation. but it is how we're viewing climate in our region. I was in Florida last week, and South Florida is going to be gone in 50 years. It'll be underwater. New York City, underwater along the coast. Alaska, where I've got projects. Coastal villages are already being displaced. In our region, it's fire and smoke. You can't run away from it. So we've got to do something, we've got to act. And that's what the IPC is saying. Got 12 years to turn it around. The trees will help decide how big an issue this becomes. Right now, we're on a collision course, but the trees are really important. The only way to pull massive amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere is through protecting forests and managing them better to be climate smart. And there are limits on what forests can do, so we've got to get off of fossil fuels. So here's what some of the folks at Oregon State University are saying we need to do to plug the leaky bucket. We've got to reforest sites with native trees where appropriate. We could plant more in agricultural fallow fields that would benefit from planting trees. And we got to reduce logging. If we do this in the state of Oregon, we will have a huge effect on ameliorating the climate impacts. And of course, other states have to do it as well. We can't be alone. And this kind of practice needs to change. We now know the areas that burn the most intensely in forest fires are in this kind of landscape situation, highly cut over industrial logged forest. I took this on my way back from Portland over the summer. You can see all the smoke, and you can see all the clear cuts in the foreground. So we have created a landscape more prone to these kinds of forest fire events, along with climate change. The Northwest Forest Plan, there's talk that it could get revised in the Trump administration. Not a good thing. We already seen what's going on with the Tongass. So our periscope is up. In terms of where the Trumpsters are going to go with the Northwest Forest Plan, we're probably going to hear next year. So here's my schematic of putting it all together. So if we want to avoid this, we need to do this, what's inside the bubbles. Keep more forests standing, keep more carbon in the forest, more atmospheric carbon in the forest, more dinocarbon in the ground. So fossil fuels, that's what that means. If we do that, we pick up biodiversity and all these other benefits that we get from nature, including water, which is going to be incredibly important in dry regions of the state. I like this, take an ecosystem stress pill. The more we stress out these ecosystems, the more likely they're not going to be able to give the benefits that we need. So we've got to do something about better management of this. Get connected means landscapes need to be connected so wildlife can move around and find new places as the climate shifts on them. They can't do that with clear cuts in the way. And then plug the leaky bucket. So we could be doing more restoration, and we could be lengthening the time between timber harvest rotations on private lands. Right now, it averages about 35 years, what you saw in that one graph, with the carbon not in the forest that long. If we double that to 70, we would have a huge climate benefit. And so I'm going to leave you there, and I know John's going to pick it up on his end, and so's Courtney. But I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of the science behind why forests are so important, and the newest discoveries, and been working on this now for 30 years. We've known that old growth is really important. A lot of this is now a new discovery, that forests are intimately linked with our climate and our future.
BARC is a watchdog group, volunteer-led and grassroots, organized here in Portland since 1999, working specifically to protect the Mount Hood National Forest. This is what we do. And a big part of this is just helping communities around Mount Hood National Forest to understand forest ecology, to kind of get off the beaten path, off the typical recreation areas, and to see what's going on in the forest as its ecological processes are going on, and to see what the federal agency, the Forest Service, is doing, what the impacts of federal management really are. So here's a map of the Mountain View National Forest in proximity to Portland. So take a second to look at this map, and then I'm going to ask you all to just point in the real direction from where you're standing right now, where Mount Hood National Forest is. Good. The corner back there is confused. Confused because I put the map north is not up on this map. And so just to kind of shake it up a little bit to say that the way that we typically perceive things and culturally, the context that we've put on our forests, on our landscapes, we can very easily turn that around and see things in a different way. When you look at the forest this way, when you look at Portland this way, to me it looks a lot closer than it does when we have the map flipped the other way. Seeing the Columbia River, being able to see the arc of the Columbia River as it goes out to the west, out to the ocean, all of this just puts, for me, I really see Portland as surrounded by these really big landscape features that sustain us, and we might take that for granted most of the time. This is a map of all the federally managed lands in Oregon, of which Mount Hood National Forest is one, and this includes the tribal lands as well, which are not managed by the federal government. National grasslands, monuments, and things like that. All told, Oregon has, I believe, 17 million acres of federally managed lands, and so that is a lot of ground that we have to work with to implement some of the changes that Dominic's alluded to. I'll talk a little bit more about those. This, I hope, speaks for itself. 1620 is the year that the Mayflower landed. In 1850, and you can see the westward expansion by the early 1900s. Existing old growth forest is really hard to come by, and by the time that Mount Hood last put its forest management plan together, some of the only remaining old growth forests in the nation are part of the country. You can't see what's up there. Impacts, we talked to, Alex brought up the glacial effects that we're seeing on Mount Hood, and Dominic's talked about fire. We also want to remember that we are in a very water-rich part of the country here, and that's going to be a really important resource as the climate continues to change. We're already seeing the impacts to wildlife and salmon in particular. With stream temperatures rising, the Columbia River right now is basically uninhabitable for salmon. They have to jump out into tributaries, into the cold water spots in order to survive as they navigate upstream. A salmon who attempted to stay in the main stem of the Columbia would never make it. It would be under too much stress. And so these are things that we can point to right now. But like I said, we have 17 million acres of public lands, and much of those forested lands, generate the water, and this is where the headwaters are of all these tributaries. This is John Talber's slide. I think you have a more updated one than this.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty close. Just to frame it up a little more simply, that wood products in the state are the #1 emitter of carbon into the atmosphere, and it's something that hasn't been addressed either in state or federal regulations. On the other hand, our forests have an incredible capacity to sequester carbon. We're doing okay right now, getting about 50% of the state's annual emissions sequestered each year. These are some guard folks, some of them are in the room. I put you in the picture so you would feel special. And actually, this photo is in one of the units of the Crystal Clear Timber Sale, which I'll give you a little bit more information about here momentarily. This unit was dropped because there are some of these legacy trees, these very old trees in that area.
Yay.
Yay. That's what that means. I'm getting kind of cross-eyed from looking this way. There's just a lot of words on this slide, and I think Dominic already gave a better version of this, indicating the potential of national forests across the country as carbon sinks. What Dominic didn't tell you is that the Forest Service in particular has been directed by the administration to increase logging in national forests 30% across all the national forests in the nation. So that's 119 national forests. It's I don't even know, like 180 some million acres.
Has your organization ever sent a letter to the White House that this is so dangerous?
I don't know, maybe.
Personal letter, please. Thank you.
Okay. And you can see that the photo in the background is kind of a typical, that's pretty typical treatment. The Forest Service refers to logging as a treatment. Everything they do is about prescribing and health and treatment. So they don't say we're going to log this unit, it's we're going to treat this unit. One of the timber sales that we are opposing right now is the this North Platte timber sale, which is a recent proposal. That's just outside of Estacada, and it's 4,000 acres, and it's the first, well not the first, but I think for about 10 years we didn't see a single clear cut proposed on Mount Hood National Forest, and this last year or two they've started to propose clear cuts again. And this is important because in the cultural understanding of logging, clear cuts are a thing of the past. We've moved beyond that. We made it, many people believe, illegal to do clear cutting. That's just not true. The reason that the agencies don't typically clear cut anymore is because the public gets really upset at them. And the assumption that the agency won't clear cut because of some standard or some legal restriction is, I think, giving people kind of a false sense of confidence that the agency's not doing these kind of practices anymore. And additionally, folks may have heard of a newer forest product called cross-laminated timber, or CLT. There was a building to go up not too far from here. There was a plan for, I forget what the name of that building was. That would have been a CLT building, and there was a lot of hype about how you would be it would be a climate neutral building because there would be wood, the wood that you build with would sequester carbon in the building itself, and that the manufacturing of CLT is somehow less carbon intensive than typical lumber, which just none of those things are true. And so I think it's just very clear that our land managers and our governors and city planners and people like that are feeding each other information in a very particular way to make the public kind of accept things that really should be paying more attention to and scrutinizing and looking at what are the impacts of these practices. I know you've said that they're new and that there's something more responsible about them, but we find that there really isn't. Another recent timber sale, the Crystal Clear timber sale, is 12,000 acres, so the largest timber sale ever planned on Mount Hood, or at least since Park's been around, so for 20 years. A third of that sale is mature and old growth forest, or native forest, which we refer to forests as native if they were, if they sprang from a fire rather than from a logging or some other mechanical or human disturbance. And so there's really no reason, there could be no possible health reason to log a native forest or a mature forest. The reason that forests survive to maturity is because fires come through and those trees survive over those different disturbance events. And it's just, it really makes no logical sense, but that's what we always hear, right? That if we allow this forest to maintain in its current structures, then it's going to be susceptible to fire, it will burn. And so logging is the solution, to assume that logging would somehow prevent a fire from happening. So, we've heard a little bit about carbon from Dominic, and I think that there's some really specific things that we want to see on Mount Hood in particular, and this community here, the people in this room, the people who in the Pacific Northwest who have been part of what is now a forest defense movement. It exists kind of in its own lane from the larger environmental movement. Have an opportunity to show that on our forests, on Mount Hood, in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, we can kind of steer this management in a particular direction that would be really set a very good example for other forests in the nation, despite the administration's going the other direction. So obviously prohibiting the logging of mature native and old growth forests, expanding buffer zones around rivers, streams, and watersheds. This is also something that's really important for wildlife, as Dominic mentioned. Using prescribed fire instead of logging to move plantation areas toward a more natural structure. So plantation areas are planted, by the agency or by a land manager to have a crop of trees, have the forest grow back as a crop, so easier to harvest in the future. And you'll hear folks talk about thinning because this was a plantation in the past, and so now it's come back in this way that's unnatural. Bringing that heavy machinery in, building the roads to get into that area, those are the things that have a really negative impact in the long term. Whereas fire, which may occur naturally, if you're lucky, but using fire as a tool is something that we understand to be a less destructive way to manage on those plantation or those previously managed areas, and to turn them back into a more natural structure. And then wildfire, to let that fire burn when it's in the backcountry, when it isn't, going to threaten a community, to give fire the opportunity to change the forest as a natural process, and to always confront the narrative that fire is so scary and bad that we have to do anything we can to stop it. And then roads. So Mount Hood National Forest is about 1 million acres. You can drive straight across it on Highway 26 in about 2 hours. But there are 3,000 miles of roads within the National Forest. The majority of them are logging roads, older roads, just dirt tracks. And all of those roads convey water in ways that is not the typical way that water would flow on the forest. And so we have lots of erosion, sedimentation, things like that really impact our stream, water quality, stream temperatures, and things like that. And so, number one, to remove roads, and that's a kind of an industrial job. You need like backhoes and stuff. There's a lot of work to be done. Similar work, to logging work, at least in the kind of machinery that you use. And so there's a real opportunity there to put people to work for restoration. Okay, so the real, I think, for me today, for what I want you all to understand is that while the Mount Hood National Forest is managed by the federal government, it's also managed by its own local forest service. Those folks live in the area. They may, some of them live in Portland. You can run into them on the street. This is not one of them. But being visible on behalf of Mount Hood and understanding that we don't have to go through the federal administration in order to see changes on this national forest is really important. And so what BARC has coordinated for ourselves right now is looking at ways that we can use the influence of the Portland community and communities around the forest to encourage the Forest Service to take its own action, despite what the administration is saying, give itself its own guidance based on what communities here need. And one of the things we need the most is the water. This is referring to all the forests in the nation, and it is more people drink water from national forests in the country than from any other source. In Portland and in Mount Hood, over 1 million people, probably every single person in this room and everyone you know, drinks water that comes from Mount Hood National Forest. We've talked about this, and the majority of headwaters in Mount Hood start with the glacial flow. The Bull Run, which is our drinking water source for Portland, actually doesn't start in the attic with the glacial source. But if you're in Clackamas, if you're anywhere else in the forest, you're getting water that originally started with the glaciers. And so are those municipalities planning for this? Are they assuming that the water will always be there? Those are the kind of questions we want to bring up and let folks know that the Forest Service is ultimately, holding the keys to your the headwaters of your drinking watershed. So you should make sure that they know what you think. I just put this in here to give myself a break to think about things, because I was going to type. This is a reminder that we can act locally in very specific ways to change the way that this forest is managed and to set an example for other forests. This is a spotted, or a rough skin to nude. Now, here's my pitch for you to take action. We have a campaign, we call it Free Mount Hood. What are we freeing Mount Hood from? We're freeing it from a very misguided set of priorities that the Forest Service currently manages for. That is the forest plan. The forest plan is kind of like a zoning plan. So each national forest has its own specific plan. The plan that Dominic referred to, the Northwest Forest Plan, is on top, it like layers over all of the National Forest independent plans. This is where we have an opportunity. This is what we can talk about to the forest supervisor, to the district rangers. This is where we can ask them to make changes on our national forest. The campaign looks like this. It's pretty fun. And it's very simple. Change your forest plan. Instead of trying to convert mature and native forests into plantations, try to protect the growth of the mature forests. Actually include standards and guidelines for carbon sequestration and storage, which don't exist in it at all currently. Permanently protect aquatic systems in roadless areas, which we've seen in the Tongass and other places, those are already getting threatened, and remove old roads. Once you remove old roads, you can have beavers. This is just a bonus beaver. Beavers are rare on Mount Hood. They're rare in most places that are within their historical range. There were 400 million beavers in the continental United States in 1620, you know, when the Mayflower arrived. Now there's about 15 million. And what beavers do is change landscapes so that they are more water absorbent. And once that water starts to settle and sink into the aquifers, once the precipitation, you know, evaporates. No, like cycles. Right? We're not going to have the same kinds of snow. We're going to have more rain. We're not going to have so many glaciers. We're going to have beavers holding water up in the headwaters if we can put them back there. And so BARC and a lot of groups actually in the Northwest and in Washington in particular are looking for ways to get more beavers back on the public lands, kind of to counteract some of the impacts and the loss of water storage because of climate change. This is just the things you're supposed to write these all down so you can go check out the websites later. I believe this is my last slide. I hope that you are all much more energized than I'm able to invoke right now. And thank you.
So while they're queuing up my slides, I just want to say I'm really energized by this crowd right here. I mean, I've been working in the forest movement for decades, and it's always been difficult to kind of organize in urban areas because so many people just don't get out to the forest. It's not one of the things they do. But what we really need to do politically though is to tap into all the great energy here in Portland, the energy that helped pass the No New Fossil Fuel Infrastructure Resolution, that knocked down Pembina, that passed 100% renewable energy. That's the kind of energy we need, and we now need to take it to the forest. So hoping we can kind of tap into that tonight. So I'm here to talk about the climate impacts of industrial forest practices, and it's going to be a focus on Oregon, but it has implications for many other states in the country and regions around the world where these practices prevail. Now, given the time limitations, this is going to be simply a high-level overview, but if you want to follow up, look for a series of upcoming seminars. Apparently I'm not talking loud enough.
There's a mic there.
Here, right behind you. It's better.
Okay, or I could double up. Look for a series of seminars and webinars coming up. Yeah, this is much better. In the next couple of months, look for the announcements either at Center for Sustainable Economy's website or the website of our political affiliate, Sustainable Energy and Economy Network. You've got the websites there. Here's my contact information. You might want to snap a photo of that if you want to follow up. So before I jump into the climate piece, let me give you a bit of background about what motivates my work and many others in this field, as well as both the ecological and political economy contexts in which the fight over industrial forest practices is taking place. So the thing that motivates me and drives my work on this is in essence just a desire to protect life itself, human and non-human alike. As you know, life is exceedingly precious. The sobering truth is that despite decades of exploration within our solar system, in deep space, looking for the signatures of life, this is the only place we know about in the universe that actually harbors life. And it is like, I believe it's like a moral obligation that we have to make sure it perpetuates and sustains itself in all of its diversity. Thank you. In fact, I think that's what actually makes us human. What distinguishes humans from other species is this ability to use our minds, our technologies, to actually care for and nurture other species along. But we're really doing a lousy job of that, aren't we? We're in the 6th mass extinction, and things are getting worse by the day. The extinction rate, and Dominic, maybe you could correct me, anywhere from 1 to, was it like 5 or 6 species per day? I mean, that's scary stuff, right? And so, so we really have to so this kind of frames this work on climate change, right? Because some of the key drivers to this mass extinction crisis are climate change, habitat loss, and pollution. And at the center of those 3 drivers is this conversion of beautiful native forests in all their magic and splendor and diversity and coolness and quiet and peacefulness, conversion of these forests, or colonization of these forests more directly, by kind of these homogeneous rows of timber plantations managed with clear cutting and chemicals and fertilizers and unbelievable amounts of logging roads, all to feed the increasing global trade machine. Now, I use this word colonization deliberately because I think it's an apt description of what has transpired in so many different dimensions. So colonization of the native forests with tree plantations, obviously, but culturally, of course, the whole process began with the colonization of indigenous lands by settlers and private logging companies. Now, more recently, this colonization has taken the form of colonization of the wood product sector itself by these global investment entities like Campbell Global, who, they're run by investors, they're run by Wall Street. They don't, their very DNA is incompatible with the whole notion of thinking for the long term, of managing for the climate goals that are so important for us to attain. So, so the problem is that as the sector has been colonized by these entities, they're displacing more and more of the smaller, more sustainable operations like Ben runs, or competing against them. And therefore, we've got this crisis where we've got these companies that are actually running the show now. They're not rooted in Oregon. They don't have long-term climate goals as their front and center. And it's like a big fight against these Wall Street-driven entities. Now, in Oregon, this is who is at the heart of the problem. These are a group of over 24 timber industry CEOs whose lobbying arm, the Oregon Forest Industries Council, has been able to dominate the state's forest policies for decades and amass over $300 million a year in tax breaks and subsidies that come out of the pockets of taxpayers. It comes out of the expense of schools, infrastructure, and social services. Now, one of the key tactics to keep us from modernizing our forest laws or reining the timber industry's practices in on the climate front is science denial. So here's what they have to say about an OSU study that came out last spring that corroborated our previous estimates that the timber industry was in fact the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And for those of you who can't read it, let me just read it for you. This is what the timber industry says about that study. The researchers manipulate these data in a manner clearly designed to produce a contrived outcome. Because the assumptions are entirely untethered from reality, the paper is unusable in carbon policy conversations in Oregon. In other words, throw it in the trash. Deny it, throw it in the trash. This is who we're up against. This speaks volumes. So until recently, the focus of battles with these guys has mainly been about biodiversity loss. The 6th mass extinction is playing out here in the form of dwindling numbers of species that depend on native forests, native old-growth forests, native coniferous forests in the riparian zones, and of course aquatic species like salmon. And as bad as these extinction trends are, they're being made much worse by climate change, because what few intact forests are left are increasingly under assault now by a host of other factors, such as heat waves and heat stress and wildfires, less water, and more severe storms. And as it turns out, these industrial forest practices are not only the major driver of extinction in the state, but of climate change itself. So let's now focus on these climate impacts and just get into a little more detail about how these practices are driving climate change. So here's what industrial forest lands look like east of Eugene. Note the contrast between the heavily clear-cut industrial forest lands and national forest lands, which are managed much more sustainably under the Northwest Forest Plan, a forest plan I helped get in place back in the late 80s and early 90s. You can see we don't have a contiguous blanket of forest any longer. It's like basically being managed in a manner that ensures that half of the forest is gone at any one point in time. This is a closer look at the damage. As we'll see later, everything that's brown or light green in this is an emission source, not a sink. It's a really important point. Even closer, this is a view of the Jetty Creek watershed, which is the drinking water supply for Rockaway Beach. And these new clear cuts come at a time when drinking water is already at risk from a warmer and drier climate. So this is like an entirely unacceptable situation in so many dimensions. Water, fish, wildlife, plants, fire risks, tourism and recreation, just to name a few. But it turns out it's also a disaster for climate change and climate resiliency. Compared to the carbon-rich blanket of forests that we inherited from nature, these cut-over lands, this kind of industrial forest regime, is putting inexorable upward pressure on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere at the very point in history when scientists are saying we desperately need our forests to help us get back, to start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere to get us back to the 350, shout out to 350 folks, the 350 ppm scientific safe zone. So this is what we're up against. So to kind of get in a little more detail about the mechanics of how these practices are driving climate change, it's important to compare and contrast the carbon cycle we inherited from nature, and let's call it nature's baseline, with the carbon cycle that as it's been altered on industrial forest lands. And for this, I'm using a wonderful illustration that comes to us courtesy of Natural Resources Canada. So take a look on the left side. So this is kind of depicting the carbon cycle in natural forests. Natural forests take in lots of carbon from the atmosphere. They emit some from decomposition, a little from fires as well. But the key point is that over time, they take in a lot more carbon than they release. And as a result, the soil carbon is built up over time. And in the Northwest, this process has gone on probably continuously for 10 to 12,000 years since the last glaciation. Is that about right? Yeah. And so that's the kind of the natural carbon cycle. So in contrast, take a look on the right side of the diagram. Under the industrial plantation model, most of the carbon stored in the big old trees and the soils is depleted as plantations are first established. Less carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere because so much of the land is deforested at any one time. And we have a suite of new emission sources associated with logging and milling and decomposition of waste in landfills and biomass burning. So the accumulation of carbon on the land and in the soils comes to a halt, and as a result of all this, atmospheric CO2 concentrations rise. So the bottom line is that as natural forests are cleared to make way and are replaced with industrial tree plantations, we replace an efficient carbon catch and store system with one that we can call catch and release. And so, that's kind of the basic setup. So that's the basic story, and indeed, this is what the scientific data on forest carbon stocks and flows in Oregon show. It shows less carbon storage, higher emissions, and diminished sequestration capacity relative to nature's baseline. Now, one crystal clear finding is that we're in a serious carbon storage deficit, meaning that most of the carbon that nature intended to leave here on the ground is now circulating in the atmosphere. This chart shows the difference between the carbon density, which is expressed in tons per acre, of native old-growth forests, which Dominic pointed out are among the most carbon-rich terrestrial ecosystems on the planet, with what now exists on various ownerships in Western Oregon. On industrial forest lands, as you can see, about 2/3 of the carbon stock that one could expect in a natural forest with a lot of old growth has been evaporated, is now circulating in the atmosphere. So in 1990, scientists, and this is 1999, scientists Mark Harmon, Bill Farrell, and Jerry Franklin found the following. Let me just quote from them. Mass balance calculations indicate that the conversion of over 5 million acres of old-growth forest to younger plantations in Western Oregon and Washington in the last 100 years has added 1.5 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere. So that's equivalent to 90 years converting into CO2. That's equivalent to 90 years of Oregon's currently reported statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And the conversion has continued since then, albeit at a slower pace, driving not only climate change, but extinction. Now, the data also show that we're in a serious carbon sequestration deficit. In particular, the transition from a lush, contiguous carpenter forest to a typical industrial forest landscape like this, where tree cover is about half gone at any one time, has quite obviously reduced carbon sequestration capacity. No trees where they were before means no carbon sequestration. The concept's pretty simple. And in the language of climate science, this is called an indirect emission because the effect on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere is exactly the same as if you just had a new emission source. So it doesn't really matter. That concentration is increased if you remove the sequestration function or you increase emissions. And so that's kind of the essence of this carbon sequestration effect. Now, the data also shows, it's very interesting, that this carbon sequestration, and we're calling carbon sequestration dead zones after harvest, it lasts for about 13 years. 13 years after a clear cut goes in, it emits more carbon than it sequesters. So we've got these huge portions of the landscape that are not only not sequestering carbon, but they're actually emitting carbon. You never hear this from decision makers, do you? Or any of the forums you go to on forest carbon in Oregon. This is a major significant point. Another way to look at the carbon sequestration deficit is in terms of what I call the carbon sequestration ratio. And that ratio is simply the amount that's absorbed by a forest divided by the amount that goes out. And so in a natural forest, you'd expect it to be quite high because, of course, the soils are accumulating carbon over time. And so this chart shows that ratio for each ownership in Western Oregon. And there's a lot of nuances here, but for the time being, just assume that what's the nature's baseline? Well, the nature's baseline is probably north of what is being attained on BLM's lands right now. And let's just say it's like 7 or 6 or 7.0, 6.0 in that range. That means that in a natural forest setting, there's 7 tons of carbon coming in for every 1 ton of carbon going out. Now, on industrial forest lands, as you can see on the far right, that's now been depleted to a ratio of 1.0. What that really means is the difference between 7.0 and 1.0 means that 6 tons of carbon per acre per year that used to be taken out of the atmosphere is now, that's just not functioning, or that's now staying in the atmosphere. So that's the essence and the most important point about this indirect emissions effect. So we've got less carbon storage, less carbon sequestration, and then of course, there's the emissions. So in 2015 and again in 2017, CSC published the very first estimates of carbon emissions attributable to logging in Oregon. In our 2017 analysis, we estimated those emissions to be about 33 million metric tons of CO2 per year, making it by far Oregon's #1 emission source. Now, last April, we were very pleased to have these figures corroborated by OSU researchers who found the very same level of carbon emissions over the same time period, albeit with a different methodology, not a totally different methodology, but somewhat different methodology. But either way, the specific components of these emissions are pretty well established, pretty easy to get the data for. They include the emissions from decay of wood products after harvest, minus whatever is stored in landfills and structures after about 100 years. What most people don't realize is once wood is cut from the forest and enters the wood products life cycle, most of that carbon is eventually evaporated into the atmosphere over a 100-year time frame. Very little remains either in landfills or in structures after that time frame. So you add to that the sacrifice sequestration capacity we just talked about, the emissions from decomposition and burning of logging slash, the emissions associated with soil disturbance, the emissions that are embodied in chemicals that are sprayed on the forest and the fertilizers that are sprayed on the forest, the emissions associated with the industrial facilities themselves, the emissions associated with transportation. It adds up to a very big deal, and like I said, it's like the #1 source of emissions in the state. But guess what? They're not reported. The Oregon Global Warming Commission, in its biennial greenhouse gas inventories, completely leaves out that sector, despite A, a legal duty to actually report emissions from all major sectors in the state, and B, repeated requests by our organization, Dominates and others, that they do so. So this is a big part of the problem with making progress on this issue in the state. We'll get to that more in a minute. So those are the ways that industrial forest practices are driving climate change, but that's only half the story. The other big part of the story is all of the ways in which these practices and the plantations and those cut-over lands are undermining our ability to adapt to climate change itself by increasing fire risk. Yes, we've got a whole range of factors. So increasing fire risk, these plantation lands, as Dominic pointed out, burn hotter and faster than natural forests. And all this noise about thinning the national forest to reduce fire risk is actually increasing fire risk because it's making these native forests that are much more resilient to fire look more like plantations. So that's another big barrier to making progress on this issue, because everyone is just kind of bought into that argument that we need to go out there and thin. So clear cutting also reduces the amount of water we're getting out of the watersheds. It increases water temperatures, which then lead to increases in toxic algae blooms. Look what happened with Salem last summer. Even the Army Corps of Engineers, hardly a bastion of progressive thought or environmental leaderships, cited extreme logging as one of the factors associated with Salem's water crisis. Major issue is what's happening with our water supplies. Then when we finally do get into a wet pattern, we get these more intense pulse storm events, we get more landslides. The background rate of landslides increases by 200 to 400% on heavily clear-cut lands. And finally, flooding. Long-term studies have shown there's like a 50 to 100% increase in major flooding in these heavily cut-over watersheds. And the problem, from an equity standpoint, is that many of these effects are borne by those who can least afford to adapt. And here's a quote from, do you know Phil Note? He's one of the co-authors of Oregon's Climate Change Assessment, professor at OSU. Here's what he had to say in a recent Oregon Live post. The negative impacts of climate change will not affect everyone equally. Those on the margins, low-income communities, indigenous people, and those who depend heavily on natural resources will be hit hardest by the coming changes. This is and will continue to be the case in rural Oregon unless drastic changes are made to how we manage these industrial forest landscapes. So in the last few minutes here, I'm just going to wrap up with what are some of the policy solutions. So we can think of the policy solutions into two major buckets. One is on the demand side of the equation, one is on the supply side of the equation. The demand side solutions are demand reduction and product substitution. Wood products, conventionally produced wood products in Oregon are a carbon-intensive good, and as a carbon-intensive good,
We need to reduce demand just like we would with fossil fuels and any other carbon-intensive good in the economy. We could do that through conservation and efficiency. We could also recognize that vast amounts of wood products are currently wasted. Wood and paper waste are the single biggest components of landfill waste in the US and in Oregon. Certainly there's room for improvement there. We could also substitute less carbon-intensive goods, solar and wind energy for biomass, bamboo for many of our paper and wood products as well. Things like bamboo that can be grown on agricultural lands without the disturbance to our forests. So on the supply side, the big solution is scaling up climate-smart forestry, the kind of forestry that Ben and his family practice on his land. And the key to, so such practices include afforestation, reforestation, ecological restoration of plantations, long rotations, forest carbon reserves, selective harvesting. The Northwest is blessed with people who have done the science, who have the on-the-ground experience in doing climate-smart forestry. This is what we need to scale up. These practices operate in this sweet spot of simultaneously increasing sequestration, increasing storage, reducing emissions, and improving climate resiliency. So that's the on-the-ground solution that needs to happen. And recently, these climate-smart forestry has been flagged as like the single most important natural solution that we need to implement in addition to fossil fuel reduction. So where are the policies to get us there? I've just got 2 more minutes on this. So we've got 2 buckets of policies. We've got administrative actions, things the governor and her agencies can do right off the bat, like halting the logging of old-growth forests in our state lands, stop using the Oregon Forest Research Institute as a propaganda arm of the timber industry, start telling the truth about industrial forest practices, take a look at procurement and investment policies to actually increase demand for climate-smart forestry. And then on the legislative side, we definitely need legislative solutions as well. We have tried unsuccessfully so far to get the Clean Energy Jobs Bill framework amended to include the timber industry. But if that's not going to happen, and I would encourage those of you who are eager to get out and support it, don't give away your support for free. Ask for something in return. And that's something should be what the scientists are telling us to do, is to also have a natural solutions legislation passed as well. And so we've been working over the last couple of years to get bills written to do that. And we've got several in the hopper right now. One is called one will actually, and thanks to Representative Andrea Salinas from Lake Oswego, to getting these through to Legislative Council, so these bills are ready to go. One would actually pull all the tax breaks and subsidies the timber industry is getting now, $300 billion a year, and redirect those to scale up climate-smart forest practices. You ought not get a tax break. You ought not get a tax break for forests on your land if there's no forest there, right? And so it's pretty easy to make that case. Another bill we're calling the Safe Waters Act. That would prohibit clear cutting, chemical sprays, and fertilizers in our drinking water supplies. So look for those this upcoming session. And I just want to leave you with some of the frustrations that despite all these solutions being on the table, the governor and her agencies are a pain in the butt. They're just not moving at all. They're taking us in the absolute wrong direction. And we aim to change that. So please sign up and get involved.
My name is Ben Doingling, and I have a tough act to follow. Okay. I have a really tough act to follow. There's 3 really amazing presentations here. So, real quick introduction about me. My family has Xenoforest, Xenoforest Products, which is a forest and sawmill and millwork operation just outside of Salem. And it's been in our family for over 30 years, and we have gotten to know this little piece of forest really well, and I'll tell you all about it as we go through the next couple minutes. But I wanted to start with this question. We've all been sitting here for a really long time, so I'm going to have everybody stretch your legs a little bit. Stand up if you live in a house or an apartment or somewhere with a roof. jump around a little bit. Now, sit down if the place where you live is made out of stone or concrete or steel. Or brick, or, so I'm guessing everybody else here who's still standing is living in a house made out of wood. Okay, you can go ahead and I'll sit down. On average, each single-family home in Oregon uses about 4 log truckloads of logs. So I don't know how many people are in this room, but there's 2 to 3 million board feet of woods represented by the folks here in this room tonight. We're all users of wood. We use it, we interact with it, we use it every day, we interact with it every day. It's, I would argue, one of the fundamental building blocks of our civilization. We've used it for forever as humans. I would argue wood is always better than the alternative. Steel, concrete, plastic have higher carbon footprints than wood. We've learned a lot about the carbon footprints of forests and timber and logging, but wood is going to be better than the alternative. That being said, all wood is not created equal. We've seen a lot of slides about different ownership types in Oregon, and each of those ownership types has its own story about how that wood is grown, how those trees grow. And every board in your house has a story, where it came from. Oops, sorry. It came from somewhere in the world. It might have come, from a pine plantation in Brazil. It might have come from an oak forest in Indiana, or it may very well have come from somewhere in the Coast Range here in Oregon. How it grew, when it was cut down, who lived close to that tree in that forest, how it was transported, how it was milled. Those stories are all interesting, yet it's a story that's rarely told. In reality, your home is probably a mix of boards from all over those different places. And I want to tell a story about a particular forest, the forest where I spend my time. But before we do that, I want to kind of walk through some ways to think about the relative merits of a forest. So bear with me here. I'm going to create a little graph, and we have our 2 axes. On this axis here, we have increasing ecological complexity. On this axis over here, we have increasing short-term profitability. Now, as we go up, I would argue that forests become Commonwealth positive. They are providing more benefits than they are taking from us as Oregonians who live here in this ecosystem. They're providing clean air, clean water, they're sequestering carbon, they're providing a lot of Commonwealth benefits. As you move this way in the graph, a forest becomes economically viable, and to be honest, it's got to pay for itself at some point. And so as we move that way, it gets more economically viable. Most forests in Oregon probably plot somewhere on this diagonal axis. You have a wilderness area up here, very ecologically complex. It, however, is not economically viable. It's going to cost us as taxpayers to maintain that forest. All the way down here at the bottom on the right, you have a short rotation plantation. Not complex, but large short-term profits. I would argue that we want to be focusing our forest management in this direction, trying to reach that quadrant. That, for me, is the holy grail of good forestry. Being both profitable and ecologically complex. And I have to give credit to Peter Hayes for this chart. Some of you may know that guy here. He's amazing. Hi, Peter. So I did not come up with this. He did, but it's a fantastic tool. So the Xena Forest is a block of forest just outside of Salem, and it's right in the middle of the Willamette Valley. It's the largest block of contiguous forest left in the valley. The valley has been parceled up into farms and fields and houses and roads and towns, and there's very little tree cover left in the forest. It's a different ecosystem than the Coast Range of the Cascades. It has a lot of hardwood, it has a lot of Oregon white oak. The oak is sort of the iconic tree of the Willamette Valley, and there's a lot of it up on those hills. And it's protected with a conservation easement to be a working forest in perpetuity. So we have a dual mandate to maintain the ecological complexity of the forest, but continue to use it as a working forest. So that's my family and also the board of Xena Forest Products. And I was lucky enough to grow up there. I've lived there almost my whole life, and I'm raising my two little kids there now. And it's an oasis. It's a wonderful place that I can call home, and I get to work at every day. And we've paid a lot of attention to how we manage that forest over the years. It's our home, it's our legacy, it's where I want my grandchildren to be able to work and play and raise their kids. And so we've paid attention to how we take care of those trees. And I would argue it's about the soil. The soil is where everything happens. And without a good base to grow your forest, you've got nothing. And the soil, and these experts over here could probably add to this, but the soil is where a lot of that carbon is held in a forest, a huge amount of that carbon. And so we do a couple things to protect that soil. We don't drive machines all over the place. We have permanent skid roads that are sacrifice areas, and we pull logs from those skid roads to cable. And it protects the forest floor. Nothing ever goes on there except our footprints. It protects that soil from compaction. We try to always keep continuous forest cover. It just creates when you have continuous forest cover, you don't have these big clearings that dry out, that start degrading over time. And it just keeps a healthy and more robust and resilient forest if you constantly got trees covering the landscape. We're constantly thinning the forest. So we're constantly cutting trees, taking them out, but it's on a single tree selection system where there's a constant rotation of trees. There's always big trees and medium-sized trees and little trees. Anyway, blow down. And a lot of that has to do with carbon. It's a way to keep as much carbon as possible in the forest. The more trees we have, the longer the rotations are, and the more we protect that soil. And we're always trying to grow trees to as long a rotation as possible. I run a sawmill there in the forest, and so we work with our logs from our place, and I also buy logs from other forests in the area. And as a sawyer, I want really big trees. Those are the ones that make the really nice boards. They're more valuable. And so as a forester, I wear two hats. As a forester, we're always trying to grow trees to a longer rotation. It's a win-win for us. It makes more valuable wood products, and it creates a more healthy ecosystem that's going to store carbon and a whole host of other benefits over time. So this is our little sawmill operation. There's our sawmill. That's a really nice big Oregon white oak log on there. And a little background on the sawmill. We started it, there was no market for hardwoods here in Oregon. The Oregon white oak was not really utilized at all over the years, and so we kind of built a sawmill from scratch to try to do something with the trees that we had, because we wanted to find a model where we could keep them, and we could keep managing them over time. And so we today run a mill, and we make hardwood floors. That's one of our prime things we do. This is the store in Salem that has our floors in it. Thank you. And it's one of the things that's wonderful about what we're able to do is we're able to create not only a healthy and resilient forest that stores carbon, but we're able to create really high quality wood products from these trees. We're growing bigger, older trees. They have higher values. They're really amazing wood, make really amazing boards. And John was talking about the lifespan of wood products. When you have really high quality hardwood, it's going to last for generations and generations. And that carbon held in that floor is going to stay there for a very, very long time. And with this shift in the industry to lower quality wood products, that wood doesn't stick around very long. It doesn't last very long in the house. So working with quality, you're able to store that carbon much, much longer. So these are sort of a review of some of the benefits of working the way we do. So there's a challenge, and I'm going to bring it back to everybody here who uses wood products every day. For businesses like ours to succeed, and it's not just about me, it's about dozens and dozens of small operators all around the Willamette Valley, all around Oregon, all around the world who are doing things like we're doing. I'm representing a very large cohort of entrepreneurs doing creative things with wood products and forests. There has to be a public recognition for the financial cost of doing work the way we do. I do it because I want to, because I care about that place and I really love it. But I can only do it if I can keep putting food on the table. So there needs to be a recognition of the carbon and climate values, the water, the air, the recreation, the wildlife, all of those other benefits besides just the trees that grow in that forest in order for this to be successful. And without a marketplace that rewards that, we run the risk of endeavors like this falling apart. And the result often can be land conversion. And one of the biggest carbon emitters imaginable is conversion away from forest land. And this is just one little quick example, and I'm probably running out of time here, but this is right here. This is I-5, just north of Salem. This is a 60-acre block of forest surrounded by fields. It's one of the largest pieces of forest left in that area. That's what it looks like today, and I drove by it on my way up here to this afternoon, and the other part is going fast. So not only is that an ecological problem, that this ecological oasis is disappearing, but from a carbon perspective, the loss of the biomass on top of the soil, this was a mature standard forest, is huge, but then the soil that's being turned into a farm field, they're going to plow that soil up and the carbon is going to disappear out of that soil. And the soil loses a huge amount of carbon. That's where most of the carbon is actually stored, I think. What was that?
47%.
Exactly. So, land conversions are a very real problem here in Western Oregon. That forests are being converted away from forest use because folks think that there isn't anything, they think they can do something more economically viable if they change it away from forest. And it's a very real problem that I see every day all around us. And with that, I think I'll end it and we'll turn it over to questions, but thank you so much for having me.